passage that's probably the most famous one in terms of the original sin. So Romans 5. So Romans 5:12 says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through the one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned." The two main interpretations for this is either the immediate or immediate imputation of sin. So one reading is we all sinned in Adam, and the other reading is eventually each individual ends up sinning on their own. And I personally hold to the "we all sinned in Adam" reading of Romans 5:12, and
the immediate, right?
Yes, right.
Got it. Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and it's a couple reasons why. And the first is the point about infants in verse 14, or at least it says that some people who haven't personally sinned still die. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression. So the fact that people sin that didn't, the fact that people died that didn't sin like Adam sinned, to me is best explained, or most easily explained, if everyone sinned in Adam. In other words, why is it that infants who haven't individually sinned, why is it that they die? I think that's tough to explain. And then the other thing is of course the stronger text is 5:18, when it says one trespass led to condemnation for all men. That's pretty on the nose. And then lastly, the comparison, because there's a comparison between Adam and Christ, both as heads, and those that are united to him those that are united to Christ are justified in Christ, in their union to Christ. And it's called the gift of righteousness. And it's through union with Christ that somebody is justified, and they're made righteous in Christ. So how is that parallel to Adam if we're not condemned in Adam? And so the parallel seems to break down. And if someone says, well, I'm getting blamed for what somebody else did, but when it comes to Christ, we're getting righteousness that we didn't do, right? Or at least we're getting a blessing from Christ that we didn't earn, and it's through our union with Christ, our union with him. So it does seem like it's talking about some type of imputation, a foreign imputation, and whether, in setting aside the question of whether it's Christ's active or passive obedience, and we can discuss that if you want to, but there's some type of imputation going on, and on the Christ side, and the parallel breaks down if there isn't a similar one on Adam's side.
Yeah, because there's a one-to-one correlation between what Adam did and the consequence of his sin being passed on to us. And so, going to Romans 5:12, what I think is super clear is that he says, and so death spread to all men because all sin, and you can trace it back to what Adam did through his sin. And so I define total depravity, and I think you agree from our last time, Dan, but I'm gonna let you say, see if you do. But I define total depravity as the penalty of Adam's sin, which was death. God told Adam, if you eat that tree, you're going to die. He spiritually died. And so death spread to all men. So the punishment of his sin is what spread to them, which is death. And that's why all men are born sinful, because they're born spiritually dead. And so again, he says it right there. And so death spread to all men. So what was death? It was a consequence of Adam's disobedience. Would you agree that agree with that definition, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, That sounds exactly like 5:18. One trespass led to condemnation for all men.
And that was what I'm thinking about Jacob Arminius again too. I'm pretty positive that that's how he defined it too, because there was a distinction. Yeah. And I'm also thinking of Orton Riley, who was a Nazarene, but he wrote a great 3-piece volume systematic theology, and he talked about how original sin means that man is not culpable for Adam's sin, but liable for it. So that would be my view of immediate imputation. But I also do want to highlight too, just as Dan was saying, that Paul here in the same context of original sin places the second Adam. So he talks about the first Adam, his original sin, and he talks about the second Adam, and we can call the second Adam's work original grace. So it really is a beautiful doctrine. So the first man brought death, the second man brought life. We have original sin and we have original grace. And original grace is a counter truth to original sin, and it's a solution to it. So like Dan says, if we want to deny one from the other, well, it's kind of inconsistent. And that's what Paul's trying to say here. Just as we're dead in Adam, so too we're made alive in Christ. And in both of them is because of their federal headship. So even if you define that differently and it means different things to different people, the principle, the truth is the same. It's coming from either the first Adam or the second Adam.
Right. Now, one thing, so that's definitely what I think. I think that's the best way to read the passage. But I will say this. Let's say somebody takes the opposite view, the immediate imputation view, and on the focus on the because all sin clause. Both readings have to have an inherited sinful inclination from Adam's fall.
Yes.
And the reason why is, what if they don't sin, right? You have to have an inevitability of sin because of this in nature. Otherwise, I think you're going to go off the rails on Romans 5 altogether. And you can see that in even, so like Adam Harwood is probably one of the more famous and articulate deniers of original guilt. But even he's saying it, right? So the inherited sinful nature view should not be called the Pelagian view, because it affirms the full sinfulness of humanity from the time of conception, which Pelagianism denies. So whether you call it a Pelagian view, or maybe like in the Enlightenment, some of those Enlightenment philosophers had like this idea of tabula rasa, where, basically we become what we do, whatever we choose, that's what we become, but we're born a blank slate, or whatever the case might be. Those views are off the table based on this passage. This passage minimally is showing some type of inevitability into sin on either reading. And but although I still think that the best reading is that the inherited guilt view, that we're condemned in Adam.
And this is where I find the distinction between sin and actual sin helpful, because when we talk about actual sin, we're talking about what that individual actually willfully does against God. So infants, they're born sinners, but that's not actual sin. So they didn't actively commit a sin, but they're still born sinners. And how do we explain that? Well, we make a distinction between sin and actual sin. And maybe at first, that might seem like, well, what does that really mean? The more you dive into it, again, the clearer it becomes. I think we're not referring to like Lucas Curcio when he was born. I didn't actually commit a sin. That is, I made a willful, conscious act of rebelling against God, but I was still born a sinner. Why? Because of Adam's penalty passed on to me. Therefore, I was born spiritually dead. I was born a sinner, and I was liable for his sin, not culpable for it. And then we go back and explain that, because sin is not actual sin. There's a distinction between those two. Because I know Eastern Orthodoxy, which I just found out recently, doesn't hold to that distinction between sin and actual sin. It kind of just wants to make sin what you do. Where even Reformed theology does still hold to that distinction as well. So we are still holding to that distinction between sin and actual sin. More technical, but
no, I think that the distinction is based in Christ's teaching. So Christ talks about the good tree and the bad tree, and the good tree brings forth good fruit, and the bad tree brings bad fruit. But there's a difference between the tree and the fruit, right? Yes. So you have a bad tree bringing forth bad fruit. The bad fruit is the bad sinful actions, but the tree has a certain nature. And then I think he goes on to elaborate on it, like, out of the corruption of your heart proceed malice and slander and yada yada, like all these different things. But it comes out of the heart. But so what comes out of the mouth, those are those bad actions, but it comes from a moral character. And that's exactly right. It's a moral character issue first and foremost. But to You're exactly right, because Paul does say, hey, with regards to malice, be like infants. And that's true, right? So infants don't have like hatred in their heart and these evil plans and schemes and stuff like that. So we should be like infants in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But that's with respect to actual sin.
Yes.